I'm a neonatologist in the NICU in Stockholm, Karolinska, but I'm also a follow-up person. So I see our extremely preterm infants. I follow them up to now 12 years of age in the EXPRESS study. So, and I must admit that for me, outcomes is mainly the neurodevelopmental outcomes. So I'm a brain person. So what is then the limit of viability? Well, we all know the major factor determining that is the gestational age. But there's also this definition from the US Supreme Court that it is the age at which a fetus becomes potentially able to live outside the womb, albeit with artificial aids. And I think the discussion on when this happens will not be easier in the future. I guess you have all read this Nature Communication paper 2 years ago on an artificial system to support fetal lambs at a gestational age similar to 20 to 24 weeks. And it was possible to keep them alive for around 4 weeks in that system. So if that is applied at low gestational ages, I think that will happen, and we will have even more discussions about this. Another commonly stated definition is that the limit of viability is the fetal age at which there is a 50% chance of long-term survival outside the womb. And I think that is just a notion we have. It's just an idea from our human mind that if we can save a majority of the babies, we've got to do something. And we actually have a lot of the smallest babies in our unit, sometimes half of the unit, and this is a 22 plus 6 weeker, just born in the plastic bag. When I got the task to talk about this, it was difficult to find data on outcomes, but then came a very good meta-analysis in pediatrics recently. And this is meta-analysis of 37 studies, and it's from Norway, and they decided to use only studies from high-income countries, and they counted the survival at discharge or 1 to 6 years of age out of either all births or all live births or NICU transferred children. And we can see that if we use this definition of more than 50% survival of all live births, that is around 24 weeks. So that made me focus my talk on the 22 to 23 weekers, where we have around 25% survival rate at 23 weeks of all live births. And as you all know, if you get different results if you count the number of the percentages of NICU transfer, because obviously number of babies die in the delivery room. And for the 22 weekers, as always, there is really widespread, and it might be that the number of the percentages of surviving out of the NICU transferred is around 20%, 25%, and much lower for the percentage of all live births. What is the quality of evidence here then? Well, as you see, there were widespreads for the 22 weekers. There are a number of problems in registering live births in many countries, and there are also wide confidence intervals. But for the 23 and 24 weekers, we have better data. These are some Swedish data that has changed guidelines in Sweden. And they are based upon the EXPRESS study, that's a research study, the Swedish National Quality Register, and the Swedish Medical Birth Registry. And this was the EXPRESS study at 2004 to 2007. And we can see that if we look at the 22 and 23 weekers and all these gestational ages, there's an increase in survival rates out of all the infants admitted to NICU, I must say. And these are mainly data then from the quality register showing that there was an increase in the survival rates of all admitted to NICU up to over 50%. And I think there are always a lot of discussions in Sweden, but there were in these days as well. And I think this was one of the reasons for having a consensus guideline in Sweden in 2016. And I know that Stefan will go more deeply into this, but we have had different opinions in Sweden. We still have different opinions, I think. But for parents, it was really difficult because they found that they got unequal care. So they wanted us to come up with something together. So all the heads of the neonatal units and the Swedish Neonatal Society and the Society of Obstetricians came together and wrote these guidelines. And they are mainly based on the Express study and the Quality Register study. So they recommend then transport in utero from 22+0 and to consider antenatal steroids in 22 weeks and to recommend it at 23. C-section on fetal indication is recommended at 24 weeks but could be considered at 23. They recommend a neonatologist to be present from 22+0 and that CPR is considered at 22 weeks but recommended at 23 weeks. So it's quite a proactive way. And this study in JAMA came a few weeks ago from a Swedish network, and then I focused, it's comparing then the early Express study from 2004 to 2007 with a later cohort from the quality register. And I here first focus on the 22 weekers, where there were the 5-year survival was only 5 out of 49 in the early cohort. So it's very difficult to say very much about later outcomes in the early study, but 10% survival rate in the early study with some questions about the number of live-born infants. But here in the second cohort, we have 96 live-born infants and 29 survivors at 1 year of age, so 30% survival. So that was significantly increased. And if we go to the 23 weekers, we have in the early study 52% survival rate at 1 year and 61 in the second cohort. That was not a significant increase. But we think that the increase in the survival rates of the 22 weekers is due to the proactive consensus statement. And obviously, when they did an analysis of the proportion of infants that were surviving during the first 27 days, we find that mortality decreased, of course, and that most deaths took place during the first month of life. There are a number of limitations for this study. There were no reasons for fetal and infant deaths that were recorded, and we don't know the timing of stillbirths. It's still an observational study, although we believe there are differences due to more proactive treatment. There might have been other things happening in perinatal care. And as I mentioned, in the early Express cohort, we have only 5 22-weekers surviving. So that cohort doesn't tell us much about outcomes of 22-weekers. And long-term data is lacking for the second cohort. We are working on this, but we don't have any summarized data yet. And talking about neonatal morbidities, in the whole cohort, which was then 22 to 26 weeks, and this is population-based cohort, I forgot to mention, we saw that there was decreases in neonatal morbidities, including severe BPD and NEC. But when we talk about the smallest babies, 22 weekers and 23 weekers, there were no real changes. There was a decrease in cystic PVL from 5 children to 1 child in the later cohort, but I don't think we can say so much about that. So, we have heard Barbara's talk just previously, and that was great. But I think for the we can all agree that we have to do the follow-up for the children, and I think for the smallest ones it's really crucial. In the meta-analysis of the smallest children, there were no apparent correlations between survival rates and risks of neurodevelopmental impairments, and also no correlations between the morbidities there and the neurodevelopmental impairments. And it's probably due to the fact that we have so few data in the 22 weekers and 23 weekers. So, how do you evaluate the children then? And Barbara's just mentioned this is the common definition of how you benchmark your outcomes. And there are some variants, but this is from Moore in 2012. That you look at the neurological development, if you either have CP or if you have intellectual dysfunction or hearing or vision problems, you have a neurodevelopmental impairment. And it's mild if you have a mild CP or mild, you have cognition in the lower range, normal range, indicating learning disabilities and problems in school. And you have moderate or severe if you have more severe problems. The thing about this, as also Barbara mentioned, it does not include behavioral outcomes and coordination disorders. And this is, I think, a real problem. These diagnoses are given later in life, but really is a big problem for the families. So autism spectrum disorder and ADHD are not included, and not developmental coordination disorders. So I put this 26-weeker here in order to remember to tell you that I will now talk a little bit about the express outcomes of the whole cohort, which is 22 to 26 weekers in a national population-based study in Sweden, and they were born then 2004 to 2007, and we had 481 survivors. And the whole point with this is that you see different things at different time points when you do follow-up. So in the first 2.5 years follow-up study, we found that 23% had moderate to severe impairments. But then when we did the second follow-up at 6.5 years, 33.5% had moderate to severe impairments. And that is mainly because it's so much better to do cognitive assessments at 6 years before school starts. And if we look at which were sort of intact, no to mild neurodevelopmental impairments, this is again a part of all the assessed children, but if we looked at out of all the live-born infants, no to mild neurodevelopmental disabilities were found in 41%, so relatively intact children with possibly cognitive impairments that would show up in school. So again, here is the cognitive data from the 6-year follow-up. We had 1/3 of these babies then 22 to 26 weeks with moderate to severe impairments. That means less than 17 IQ, full-scale IQ, and 1/3 with a low IQ within the normal range, and 1/3 with a normal IQ within above -1 standard deviation. And this is a slide of composite of the Epicure study and the Bavarian study, which I think is so nicely shows that for every gestational week below 34 weeks, you have almost a linear decline in full-scale IQ. And this is for children that are possible to assess. because, as remember, we have a third of our extremely preterm children who are not possible to assess cognitively. And so I think that this fits quite well with the EXPRESS. For the assessed children, we have up to 27 weeks, then we have a mean full-scale IQ of 83. I just want to mention that even if you don't have any major diagnosis like CP or intellectual dysfunction or autism or so, as we did here, or you are apparently healthy but extremely preterm born, less than 27 weeks in this study, you have a majority of these children still have motor problems. So they have developmental coordination disorder with coordination disorders, clumsiness that affects usually their daily life at home and in school. So clumsiness is not included in the neurodevelopmental impairment. Autism spectrum disorder is not either included. And we did a screening of autism spectrum disorder in our the Stockholm cohort of EXPRESS, which is 25% of the national cohort. And we found when doing a parental questionnaire that 29% screened positive. And then we validated with a video recording of interaction. And then now at 12 years of age, we know that 21% of these extremely preterms have a clinical diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So I think this is one of the most common problems that the smallest babies will have later on. And it's not included in the neurodevelopmental impairment categorization. And these are data from the Elgan cohort, where they don't show any 22-weekers, but it's quite clear that with lower gestational ages in the 23 to 24 weekers, we have around 15% with quite a wide spread of ASD diagnosis. And this is a Swedish birth cohort of 1.1 million births in Sweden, and it's the gestational age here and the risk for ASD. And we see this goes only to 25 weeks, but we see there's really an increased risk at the lower gestational ages for autism and for ADHD, but not for suicide attempts, not for substance abuse or for criminality, and not as strong for bipolar disorders. I think this is one of the most sensitive brain areas where preterms can get problems. So I'm getting back to the first EXPRESS cohort, and I extracted the 22 and 23 weekers just for you to show how many were normal or had a mild disability. So if we look at, I told you, only 5 22-weekers survived, so I don't think we can say much about that. But 20 out of the born alive children, I have to look, 101 born alive children had no or mild disability at 23 weeks, so 20%. And if we now go back to the meta-analysis study from Norway, they included Bailey assessments, only studies with Bailey assessments. And that yielded 12 cohort studies, but that excluded all the Japanese studies because they have their own cognitive assessment scales there. And that is a pity because, you know, the Japanese have been doing the smallest babies for a long time. However, they looked at neurodevelopmental impairments out of the survivors at assessment of outcomes. And they found that if they that they had no impairment in the 27 weekers, around 75%, but then if we go down to the 23 weekers, there's a wide spread here, around 40%, and then in the 22 weekers, it's really a wide spread. So it's difficult to say. And here is the details of that study. So at 22 weeks, we have between 4 and 71% without impairment. You can see there are very wide spread results. And severe impairment is around 40% using the normal NDI definition at 1.5 to 3 years of age. And in 23 weekers, we have around 25 to 50% with the normal outcome, and 10 to 40% with severe outcome. I wanted also to share with you some of the Japanese studies, which I think are interesting. And this is a study of Japanese babies at 22 and 23 weeks, born in 2005 and 2003 to 2005 from 48 centers. And there were 75 live-born 22 weekers. There was quite a good follow-up rate at 85, and some had died. And there were 245 23 weekers, and 77% were followed up, and some had died. And we can see that no or mild impairment using their cognitive scales and using classification of CP and neurosensory impairments showed that you had normal or minimally impaired were 9 out of 75, and that is 12% of the 22 weekers, and 20% out of the 23 weekers. And then they did a follow-up on that study with a later cohort in Japan, Japanese network. And they showed that they could increase the survival rates, and this is only 22 weekers that I extracted for you. So it increased from 35% to 46%, which was in the period of 2008 to 12. And there was non-significant decrease in CP, but there were absolutely similar rates of cognitive impairments. And if you look at the 23 weekers, there were about 41% with a cognitive delay in the first period and 43% in the second period. So it was, although survival increased, it's difficult to improve cognitive outcomes. That is what I wanted to say here. And then finally, there is one meta-analysis on the long-term neurodevelopmental outcomes, because we've talked about the 2 and 3 years follow-up, when it's difficult to really find the real cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes. But here is 4 to 10 years and cognition and neurodevelopmental impairments. And this is a meta-analysis from Acta Pediatrica, including 15 studies, again high-income countries, and no Japanese studies in this one. And at 22 weeks, then we have 20%, around 20%, quite wide spread here, of moderate impairment, and this is out of the survivors. And we have 20% with a severe impairment, and 40% in total. And in the 23 weekers, we have about the same figures, actually. So, I think it is difficult to improve cognitive outcomes. And it's not shown, but it might be difficult also to improve the behavioral outcomes. And why is that? I think this is a different entity of problems. It's not a neurological lesion, but it's immaturity. So, if you are born, this is a human brain in utero from 12 weeks to 40 weeks, and you are born around here at 22 weeks. You have a very immature brain, lots of synaptogenesis is going on, lots of myelination, lots of apoptosis, and you're at a very vulnerable state. And these thalamocortical connections are just being formed, sending all the sensory information into processing at a higher level in the cortex. And these connections are being formed around 26 weeks of age. And all this is shaped by the early stimulation of the brain, the early sensory stimulation. And we all know it's very unnatural sensory stimulation if you're a baby in the NICU. I think we're not looking at really lesions, but developmental problems when we talk about cognition and autism. And we were interested to look back. We found, as I said, 21% of the extremely preterm children with autism spectrum at 12 years. So we went back to their neonatal scans, and we looked at their structural networks. And every color, this is the brain from the sagittal view, and every color here is a network or a module. And we see that there are a nice mix of colors in the term-born controls, but it's completely different in the preterm-born, extremely preterm-borns, with one color at a time. And there are a number of other differences between the ones who 6 years later became autistic. And one of the differences is that this light green network in the medial part of the brain is not enough developed with lower volumes. And that is parts of the salience network, which helps us with social cognition. And we also, and these are submitted data, but when we look at the children's brains at 12 years of age, and we choose all the ones without lesions and without high-grade bleedings, and then we compare them with full-term controls at 11 years of age, and we look at the structural hubs in the cortex, which are the most popular places in the cortex. And we see that there are many similarities. All the blue balloons here are similar, but there are also missing hubs in the extremely preterm born. And some hubs are missing in those networks that are important for cognition and social cognition. And this data has been, done by Nelly Padilla, who's here in the audience and postdoc in my group. There you are. And also, Nelly has looked at the functional networks and looked at the propagation of the brain signal in the cortex. And if you look through all these brain regions and you look at the propagation of the signal, and here are the preterms and here are the controls, you see that in most regions they actually propagate the signal a bit slower. And these are preterms who have no lesions in the brains, but they are just extremely preterm born. They have a different structural and functional organization of their brains. So I think that it's important really to do the follow-up in those smallest babies. And I was very happy to see now in November that there were European guidelines from EFCNI on all sorts of things for neonatal care, but also for follow-up. And they are actually quite aggressive. They think that we should do standardized assessment of all children that are very preterm, including neurological, motor, and cognitive testing at 2 years and before school starts. And I think when talking about peri-viable infants, if you want to work with that category of preterm infants, I think you are obliged to do good quality follow-up. Because this is, as you see, what we miss today. We don't really know. We don't have good data. This is from Acta Pediatrica, a different view, this is Per-Arne Lönnqvist, who's a pediatric anesthesiologist, who's sort of questioning what we're doing in the NICU now, these days. And he was introducing this new concept of number needed to suffer. How many babies need to suffer in order to get one baby with a good outcome? So for the 22-weekers, then he calculated it was 11 babies that needed to suffer. But then came Keith Barrington from Montreal. And I must say both these gentlemen are proud fathers of very or extremely preterm babies. But Keith was really questioning this: is disability equal to suffering in the NICU? and how much suffering takes place in the NICU and so on. But I think one thing to remember is how we need to also count what happens in the NICU, what happens before a baby dies, and I'm sure it's going to be discussed a lot this afternoon. And we also need to consider the whole family in these discussions. So, a summary and my own personal view of this, to some extent. We have few studies to look at peri-viable long-term outcomes. They are not population-based often. They do not include all live births, a great problem. There are low follow-up rates, and the years of follow-up are too few. I would say that 3 years is such an early time point, so you don't get all the behavioral problems, of course. I think we can conclude that there is a very low chance of a completely normal outcome if you are born at the limit of viability, if you're born at 22 weeks. And we know from these studies that we have that there is a wide range in the percentages of moderate to severe impairment, but around 20 to 60% in the long-term studies. I think it's a problem. NDI usually does not include behavioral problems, and we need to remember that when we read studies. And this is the personal view, but I think there's some data to support that. I don't think we can improve cognitive and behavioral outcomes with better survival rates and better neonatal care. And that is also shown not only from this Japanese study, but also from Norway and from Melbourne, that we haven't improved in the cognitive outcomes, although we have improved in many other ways in neonatal care. And on the other side, cognitive impairments, autism spectrum, and ADHD will increase with lower gestational ages. So we have to give parents the correct information about the outcomes, and many of you perhaps do, but I think we should give standardized information so it's not entirely dependent on what the doctor, the individual doctor thinks, because they always think like we think. I think you should secure standardized, good follow-up. Sometimes it can be a good thing to have unbiased follow-up by another doctor, and that you should really do that if you do the smallest babies, and that we have to take some responsibility to ensure long-term support for the families. I just want to say that sometimes good is good enough. And this is the 26-week Gabriella. She has an autism diagnosis, but she does well because she has a very good support at home and in school. And we all know that it's difficult to categorize what is a good outcome. And with that, I wanted to pose the questions. So there is no right answer to this, but I think in terms of survival rates, it's been quite much discussion about what to have in the denominator, if you would have number of surviving infants or live-born infants or infants admitted to the NICU or total deliveries. But in terms of discussing outcomes, if you want to counsel the parents in the antenatal unit, I would just like to ask you what you think would be in the denominator. Would you say that, would you present the estimates of a good survival, of a good outcome out of surviving and assessed infants, which is normally presented, or would you do it with what is the chance, if we now are proactive, what is the chance of getting a normally developed child? Or would you do it as with the denominator of infants admitted to the NICU or of total deliveries? I'm just curious to see what you think. So, yeah, very interesting. There are a number of, we are not so uniform here. So I think a majority wants to assess it by the number of surviving and assessed infants, which is the normal way of describing it in outcome studies. And if you counsel the parents antenatally, perhaps it's a good thing to say what is the chance out of the live vulnerable infants. And we also have a group here who wants to use the numbers of infants admitted to the NICU. I guess it can depend on when you meet the parents. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to thank you for the attention.